America is the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here for our special powers, principalities, and persecution. This is all inspired by Ephesians 6:12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers, over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. We need this reminder. I do, constantly. When it feels like the world is against us, it is. We are, as C.S. Lewis said, in enemy-occupied territory. He told that to the British people on the radio during World War II. They understood the analogy quite intimately. But we don't. We tend not to in America. We maybe have believed, have been told, that our life here on earth should be a pleasure cruise, eating and drinking and being merry, when really life could be a battleship, and we're under attack constantly. Now, compared to the rest of the world, it sure doesn't seem like it here in America. We got it good. This is the pleasure cruise. Life is good. We can go to church safely, even though many people around the world can't. We can preach on a street corner, even though most people don't. We can support our local pregnancy center and stop abortions, but not enough people do. We can do all the Christian things. We can pray in public, even though many people are still scared to. We can do these things when there's people around the world who can't. We take the practicing of our Christian faith for granted in this country. And when you take something for granted, you lose it. Now, one way to not take it for granted is to look at the people who don't have these things. China, for instance. We have a China expert coming up in just a little bit here, always in the business of persecuting Christians. They allow Christianity, sort of, and we'll get more details from this expert coming up, right? They infuse Christianity and communism together. They pervert Christianity, of course. And they always have to praise Mao over any made-up figure of Jesus that they come up with, right? But just the other day, 7 Christians in a single church were arrested, an underground church, charged with subverting the government. Leaders of the Christian church throughout China for decades have been imprisoned, killed. These underground churches, unregistered churches, churches that don't bow down to Mao and Xi, no house churches allowed in China. China also cracks down on parents teaching their kids Christianity as well. They don't want it to spread. The communists know that they need to get to the kids first. But I want to highlight one man in particular. Back in 2018, he was the leader of an underground church movement. His name is Wang Yi. And he wrote a beautiful letter called My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience. Please read the whole thing. My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience by Wang, W-A-N-G, Yi, Y-I. It's wonderful, but I want to share 2 highlights here. One of the main points he makes is that he's not calling for the overthrow of the Chinese government. He said they're awful, right? He's in jail right now. He said the communist regime's persecution against the churches is an incredibly wicked action, the most wicked and most horrendous evil of Chinese society. But he says, I'm not fighting for rights. That's not, we in America, we rely on our rights. Oh, we have the right to practice our religion. Well, a lot of people don't. We have a right to go to church. Well, you don't. Maybe you should do it. Then you should exercise that. But this guy in China, he's not fighting for rights. He says he has no intention of changing the institutions or laws of China. This is what he said: as a pastor, the only thing I care about is the disruption of man's sinful nature by the faithful disobedience and the testimony it bears for the cross of Christ. All he wants to do is grow the church and save more souls. That's it. Does he want to change communism? I mean, yeah, I guess maybe, but that's not his main goal. It'd be nice maybe if communism went away. That's not his goal. He just wants to save souls. And he doesn't despair about the persecution he's facing, because if God decides to use the persecution, in his words, if God decides to use the persecution of this communist regime against the church to help more Chinese people to despair of their futures, beautiful, to lead them through a wilderness of spiritual disillusionment, and through this, to make them know Jesus, if through this he continues disciplining and building up his church, then I am joyfully willing to submit to God's plans. For his plans are always benevolent and good. Hold on, you're in a Chinese prison. Still think God's plans are always benevolent and good? And so many Americans are too tired on Sunday morning to go to church. or it's annoying to get the kids ready. They don't want to dress up, or they would prefer to go to brunch or get an early start on the football games. Look up the story of Wang Yi and be inspired. We're also going to talk about Africa coming up in a little bit. Christians persecuted, Nigeria in particular. The president's spoken out about this. Presidents dropped bombs because of this. Trump said Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria. Thousands of Christians are being killed. Radical Islamists are responsible for this mass murder. We're going to talk with someone at this Christian organization called Open Door. I'm going to talk with them in the very next segment. But they say that there's an average of 8 violent attacks per day on Christians in Africa. Each attack can kill dozens of Christians. And this is mostly, led by a lot of people, but ISIS is one of the groups who are doing this. They've told Christians in Africa, you have to convert or die. Just imagine for a minute, going to a church building in Africa or having a Bible study in your home. And it's not just possible, but it's likely that during this church service, when you're singing this one song right now, when you're listening to this one sermon and reading this one scripture, that at any moment, a group of people will come in and kill you and your family right there on the spot. And you go anyway. The War Department said they're planning counterterrorism operations in Nigeria specifically to protect the Christians there. Certainly sanctions and other economic actions and all the rest. Listen, even Nicki Minaj of all people, for the love of Pete, is speaking at the UN about the persecution of Christians in Nigeria. What a condemnation on us that is, that we had to resort to Nicki Minaj to raise awareness on this issue. But we're not only going to focus around the world today. The point here is to pray for these Christians, but also to make sure that we in America never get anywhere near this. I don't want any way to be near what's going on around the world. But the way to prevent that from happening is to use our freedom well. This is my analogy. It's a new year, so I'm thinking about working out more. I don't always want to exercise. I don't always want to work out, but I can. So if I can, I have to. I just have to. Like, there's a lot of people who aren't healthy enough to exercise. Some people don't have legs. Some people have injuries where they can't run. Some people are just too old or whatever. For whatever reason, they can't run anymore. I can. I still can. So I gotta. I have to. It's on me to do it. Because some people can't, and they probably want to. And I can and don't want to. So I gotta. And I feel the same about, among other reasons, I feel the same about being a Christian. We can be boldly Christian. We can. So you better do it. Other people can't be boldly Christian. So, because if they do, they'll be killed. Now, some of those people still do. They still do go to church, even though they'll be killed when they do. And what are we doing with our freedom? We can go to church. I don't know. Tired? Are we going to waste our freedom like that? No. Shame on us. So let's not. Got some great guests today. Again, Open Door US, we're talking about Africa. Stephen Mosier will be here to talk about China. And then Jared Longshore will be here from New St. Andrews College to talk about America and to go into greater detail about Ephesians 6:12, not wrestling flesh and blood. Well, what are we then wrestling? It's all coming up right here on the First TV. I'm grateful you're here. Spread the word. Welcome back to our special here on the First TV about persecution, Christian persecution around the world. And we'll get to America in a moment. First, I want to go to Andrew Richards. He is the Senior Director of Partnerships at Open Doors US. This is the group that we talked about in the opening segment that has their world watch list about Christian persecution around the world. Mr. Richards, how do you do, sir?
Good to be with you. Thanks so much for bringing attention to this.
Well, yes, thank you for making it so we can pay attention to it. What is this world watch list, and how do you gather information, and based off what metrics?
Yeah, great question, Mike. And yeah, the important thing here is that we've been around the world on the ground in places where it's hardest to follow Jesus for the last 70 years. So over that time, we've been privileged to build relationships, friendships, networks in order to strengthen the church, strengthen the Jesus followers in places where it is most difficult. And so it's as a result of that over the last 3 decades, over 3 decades of research, along with that ongoing work and presence, the research arm has provided this list. And it's beyond just the stats and beyond a ranking. It is actually meant to be a tool to engage through prayer, through awareness, and through action.
I got the top 10 here. North Korea, Somalia, Yemen, Sudan, Eritrea, Syria, Nigeria, Pakistan, Libya, Iran. So I see this list. What are we to do with this list? And everyone has a number with it. So what do the numbers mean, and what are we to do with this?
Yeah, so we take into consideration about 6 different factors. I think probably most people, if they hear the word persecution, they think churches burned down. They think maybe more the violent expressions of persecution, which are real and sadly increasing. But there are more other factors involved in measuring these things. And so we tally up those 6 different categories. We categorize them around kind of that smash of violent persecution, but then there's also the smush, if you will, the pressures of a culture that isn't amenable to someone choosing their own faith or choosing to follow Jesus in particular. And so we tally all those up, and that's what results in that ranking. So North Korea, yeah, for the last 3 decades, they've been top of that list for obvious reasons. There's no other religion there except for the state religion of the Un family. And we've just tallied up through ground level research what is happening, what are Christians on the ground facing, how are the Jesus followers there free or not free to follow. And we've seen a lot of movement. So since the HTS pulled out, or the HTS took power in Syria, that's been a big mover this year. They've moved up about 12 spots and re-entered that top 10. And so this is just meant to be a tool for us to look at, to say, oh, wow, there is movement in this. But beyond that, to engage with those of us who follow Jesus, engage with our family in places where it's hardest, to be aware, to be in prayer. And that's the number one thing that they ask for, actually, is that they would not be isolated in their suffering and what they're facing, but they would be reminded they're not alone. And so our hope and our mission, if you will, is to not only strengthen the church where it's hardest to follow Jesus, but also allow them to know they're not alone in it.
You bring up Syria. It's so interesting because I just listed off the top 10, but that doesn't mean countries 11 through 60 are great and aren't in trouble as well and don't need our help and prayers too. What are some stories of things you've heard on the ground in these countries around the world that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so, and it's difficult to talk about these things. I know many people, maybe many of your listeners, they've got their own challenges to deal with. And I want to kind of pull back on that. This isn't just an alert and sounding of the alarm. While that is real, that is important, it's also a reminder that we're a part of a broader body of Christ globally. And so this is an invitation to take our part in that broader body and to really uplift, undergird, and strengthen the places where it's hardest, strengthen the people in places where it's hardest. And so I just want to bring attention to an area of the world where there's a lot of pain, a lot of destruction, a lot of things that don't make sense, and that's throughout the whole Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa. Nigeria has been in the news cycle, and for that, we're grateful to point a spotlight on what's happening in that whole region. But what's happening in Nigeria is indicative of what's going on in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. So about 14 countries in that whole region are seeing violence that are at their near maximum score in that category. I sat with a group of pastors from Eastern Congo, Northeastern Congo, and they were retelling and recounting atrocities and things that they were experiencing from the ADF, an ISIS-aligned rebel group holed up in the jungles in northeastern Congo, are indicative and connect to some of the strategies that are being employed in the middle belt of Nigeria as well. And these pastors, these are the heroes of the faith, in my opinion. You're not going to read their books, you're not going to listen to their podcasts, you're probably not going to even be aware of their names. But in my opinion, they're the ones who are heading back into their communities to love their enemies, to teach their communities how to reconcile, how to forgive, how to work through trauma. And so to wrap around them is an honor and a privilege. And this is an invitation just to be aware, hey, this whole area is on fire, if you will, metaphorically and also literally. And we need to be aware of that, but we need to be engaged in prayer and intercession and in practical support.
What is it about these, we'd say pastors, but also just the followers of Jesus in these places where it is so dangerous? What is it inside of them that motivates them to keep doing this? And what inspires you about these people?
Yeah, well, now we probably get a bit personal here. They are pictures in my mind and in my understanding and in my friendships that I've been able to form. They are pictures of those who know the impossible faith as it seems impossible in these contexts. They know the reality and they tell me that it's worth it. It's worth pursuing Jesus with their whole life, their heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it's not all shiny and up and to the right, obviously. This pathway of following Jesus is actually down and to the left, if you will. Down and through death comes life, and that's the Paschal mystery of following Jesus. So these followers in these contexts, Mike, they're inspirational. I learn a ton about what it means to actually follow Jesus, to cling to the truths of what Jesus taught and lived and showed us and modeled, and to see that actually make a difference in the lives of the community and family members that I find myself in, because they're doing it in near impossible circumstances. So as we know in Scripture, it says, what's impossible with man is possible with God. And these sisters and brothers, they taught me a ton. And so it's not only, my heart isn't only breaking for what they're experiencing. My heart is hoping that we would learn what it means to grasp a faith that is unshakable, a faith that is tapped into and rooted in the reality of what's going on. If you're a Jesus follower, we know our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's about principalities and powers. And these are the believers that are on the front lines, standing firm in their faith in Jesus against those principalities and powers. And to me, that means everything. And it's a privilege to be somewhat of a bridge, a tendon in the body of Christ, if you will, in order to learn from and take our part in that body.
How can people help Open Doors US and by extension help the people of these places around the world?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's beyond maybe a cause to championship, to be a champion of. It's beyond just a project to support. While we have those things, those are specific. There are specific needs in these regions. The first and foremost thing I would hope for those of us in the U.S. that follow Jesus, that we would engage our hearts. So the invitation from our persecuted family is to pray, to really join in. So pray, engage, become aware of their context, deepen your understanding of what kind of faith would hold firm in that context. And then as God moves your heart, there are specific needs that they have. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, we've got a multi-phase, multi-year campaign called Arise Africa, started by the church on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa, meeting trauma needs, rebuilding churches as people are free to return to their ancestral homes, restart up life. So there's a lot of ways that we wrap around and respond to the needs that they ask us to respond to. But first and foremost, it has to start from a place of where our hearts are and to be moved and engaged in response to what God is asking of you.
Andrew Richards is the Senior Director of Partnerships for Open Doors US. Go check him out and learn more. Andrew, great to talk to you, brother. Keep it up.
Thanks for your work. Appreciate you.
Yeah, man. Give our best to everyone over there. Thanks for spreading the word. Coming up next, we'll talk to an expert about China specifically. hear reports often, but just recently, of the communists tearing down churches and more persecution, and saying, well, hold on, how do they even have churches in China? How did that even happen in the first place? There's no churches to tear down in North Korea. So how did that happen in China? So we'll talk with our China expert coming up next right here on the First TV. Spread the word. Welcome back to our special right here on the First TV. We just talked about Africa. Let's now focus in on China. Christian persecution in China. Stephen W. Mosher is here as the author of The Devil and Communist China, From Mao Down to Xi. Mr. Mosher, great to talk to you again, sir. How are you?
It's good to talk to you this morning.
What does Christian persecution look like in China?
Well, it looks like it has looked like since the beginning of the communist movement in China. They have been killing Christians from the very beginning. Underlying all of the pretensions of communism in China and Russia was a hatred of God. And of course, Christians are exemplars of God's presence on earth, and they have always been targeted by the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, the first martyrs to communism go back to the late 1920s when Mao's guerrillas were killing them, interrupting church services and dragging out missionaries, dragging out Christian pastors and priests, and holding mock trials and killing them, death by 1,000 cuts, beheading them, and so forth. And that persecution goes on today. It's not quite as graphic in most cases because we're not allowed to see what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. But there are 10 bishops in China, Catholic bishops, who have been in prison, in solitary confinement now for years and in some cases decades. There's ongoing persecutions of Christians throughout the country, especially in places like Wenzhou, which has had a large Christian presence for a couple of centuries now. They're tearing down crosses off churches, tearing down home churches, preventing people from meeting in their own homes to hold any kind of prayer meeting. Everything is registered, monitored, controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And if you step outside of those narrow bounds, you're going to be arrested and sent to prison.
And the last thing you said is actually my next question. Excuse my ignorance on this, but I'll hear from time to time stories of the communists coming in and tearing down a church. And I think, well, how was that church ever allowed to be there? Like, how was there ever even a church there? How does that happen?
Well, there are cycles in China. There are cycles of repression and followed by cycles of relaxation. It's not that the Chinese Communist Party ever changes its basic attitude towards the church. It's just that it embarks upon one political campaign after another. And if the Communist Party apparatus is intent upon persecuting, for example, Tibetans today, it may leave Christians alone for a while, and maybe it targets Christians tomorrow, and maybe the day after that they target the Uyghurs in the far west, or they target entrepreneurs or other groups that they think are opposed to the Chinese Communist Party. It is a relentless series of campaigns. The Chinese Communist Party is always holding one political campaign or another to maintain the muscular tone of the system, you see. The minions have to be trained and retrained to enforce the rules of the Chinese Communist Party. So sometimes they target one group, sometimes they target another. For a long time, they targeted pregnant women under the one-child policy, and they dragged off millions of those each year for forced abortions and forced sterilizations. That campaign has now ended because China is literally aging and dying, losing population from year to year. That's another accomplishment, quote unquote, of the Chinese Communist Party, killing off the Chinese people to the point where China is no longer the most populous country in the world, but now is in second place to India, and its population is falling. But that's what happened. You have these what are called high tides in Chinese Gaochao, where the Communist Party targets different groups. And now they're targeting Christians very intensely. You're not allowed to hold a prayer meeting in your own home. At Christmas time, this last Christmas, just a couple of weeks ago, that Christian pastors were not allowed to hold church services on Christmas Eve or on Christmas Day. They're only allowed to hold their Sunday services during a certain period of time. They're required to let the Communist Party know who's going to be attending those services. They're not allowed to invite other people outside the formal listed registered congregation to their church services. So the controls are tightening. The walls are closing in on believers in China. And I think it's an expression of the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is losing its grip on the people. It is widely hated. If you look at what's happening in Iran, the same thing could easily happen in China. Why? Because the robust export sector of the economy in China is shutting down. Tens of millions of workers in the coastal cities have had to go back to their villages. They have no land to farm, no place to live, no means of support. And the Communist Party is right now mobilizing its 1.1 million members of the internal security force, and they're practicing crowd control, riot control. They're practicing for the demonstrations they anticipate will break out following what's happening in Iran and what's happening in Venezuela. So
Amazing.
I think the crackdown is coming, and Christians will be on the front lines of those crackdowns. Remember that the Catholic villages in China, the Christian neighborhoods in China resisted communism. They were in response, they were retaliated against by being especially targeted by the Chinese Communist Party. There were in the 30s and 40s massacres of entire Christian villages and Catholic villages in China. I'm writing about some in my latest book, The Church in China. Those episodes could easily happen again. I was visiting China a few years ago, and I visited a village in China which has been Christian for about 2 centuries, thanks to the early missionaries who went there. And they told me that because they were able to stick together during periods of persecution, they had been able to survive. But they always worried about the Chinese Communist Party coming in, the men with the guns coming in, and arresting and persecuting them. They are not allowed, if you're a Christian in China, you're not allowed to join the military. I asked them why. They said, well, because the Communist Party doesn't trust us with guns. And the Communist Party is probably right not to trust them with guns.
Whoa.
Anyway, I see.
Well, let me ask you this, because this ties in. What is the most incompatible thing between communism and Christianity in China?
Well, the most incompatible thing is the claim of communism to be a total ideology. It wants to control the hearts and minds and the souls. It doesn't acknowledge the soul, of course, but it wants to control the very being of the Chinese people. It wants to control not just how they act, it wants to control how they think and what they believe. It has its own version of what life on Earth should be, and it has its own version of its own history. It has its own version of its own ideology, where we're going to create heaven on earth. And any ideas that about a future life are anathema to that view. Of course, their history is fabricated. Their ideology is a fabrication. It's a pretense. But nonetheless, they want everyone to believe. Communism at one level is a kind of cult. And the almost 100 million members of the Chinese Communist Party are members, whether they believe or not, of this cult. Many of them join for personal advancement, of course, not because they believe in the myth that the government is one day going to fade away and everyone will be equal, but because they achieve personal advantage from joining the Communist Party. But believers...
I got about 90 seconds if I may ask this question, because I'm reading about Bonhoeffer and talking about how the Nazis would infuse their own ideology inside of the church, right? And you weren't allowed to say certain things. You couldn't talk about the Jews, and we're going to change this name to this name and all this stuff. Right? Does the communists do that with the Bible and with the churches? They infuse their communism into Christianity?
Yeah, you could, during the Nazi era, you could see churches where the altars had been draped with a Nazi flag, with a swastika. In China, you can see virtually the same thing. You can see pictures of Christ and the pictures of the saints being taken down and replaced with who? Pictures of Mao Zedong, the greatest mass murderer in human history. On the left side of the altar, on the right side of the altar, you see Xi Jinping, the current descendant of the first Red Emperor, who is equally brutal in his repression of Christians in China. And you can see a new Bible developed by the Chinese Communist Party, which takes out the book of Revelation and takes out sections which refer to the afterlife and focuses on the here and now. You can see homilies, you can see preachers preaching from their pulpits drafts of sermons that were given to them by the Chinese Communist Party and punished if they deviate from that. Now, there are a lot of people in China who won't go along with that, but if you don't, you run the risk of being arrested and punished. So yes, in the same way the Nazis tried to control the church, the Chinese Communist Party is even more meticulous in trying to control what believers pray inside their own churches.
Amazing. Stephen W. Mosher, The Devil in Communist China from Mao down to Xi. When does your new book come out, sir?
Well, I'm still writing it, so the end of the year.
Good. Look forward to that.
In
Mr.
China.
Mosher, appreciate your time. So where can people follow you and learn more about you and your writing?
Well, we're at pop.org, pop.org. That stands for Population Research Institute, which I'm the director of.
Wonderful. Stephen Mosher, thank you for your time, sir, very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. When we come back, we'll bring it to America now. And we'll talk about, we'll go back to Ephesians 6. What does this mean? We don't fight against flesh and blood, if it's principalities, like what? Like what? How are we to make sense of that? What are we to do with that? Talk about that next, right here on the First TV. Spread the word. Welcome back to our special here on the First TV. I want to go to Pastor Jared Longshore. He's a minister at Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, and he's a fellow of theology at New St. Andrews College. Jared, how are you, brother?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, man, I'm glad you're here. So the genesis of this whole conversation today about persecution around the world and here in America is Ephesians 6:12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, against this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. What does that mean? How should we be looking at? How should we live our life differently with that being true?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the American context, the first thing we have to understand is that we have, at least as of late, separated the spiritual from the physical, separated the heavenly from the earthly. And so when, say, conservative Christians come to a text like that, they think, well, I'm either dealing with some kind of physical problem that has a mere political solution, some kind of tyranny, or I'm dealing with a spiritual problem that I need a pastor for. And there's a part of that that's true, but to separate those two worlds is simply not going to work. So the persecution that you have surveyed already around the world and the different kinds of persecutions that happen in the United States are both a spiritual and a physical problem. It's a heavenly and an earthly problem. And until we learn to bring those worlds back together, we're not going to see the faith truly practiced and freely exercised in our land.
Okay, we got to go deeper into that. That's so good. So for my whole lifetime, we've lived in a country, I believe, where it's all been the physical. And with physical problems, physical solutions, that's it. And I think maybe now we're starting to get to the idea, big picture in America, no, there are spiritual forces at play. And to your point, we need spiritual solutions to that. But the next step is what you're talking about here, which is what? There's physical solutions to the spiritual problems and spiritual solutions to the physical problems. They go both ways. How does that work?
Yeah, they go both ways. I think that people are waking up to this because of COVID. I mean, when they started to shut down churches, but this was a virus, but then we shut down churches. And so what's going on here? And people started paying attention to Romans 13, which says that the civil magistrate is appointed by God and is a servant of the Almighty. And as soon as you recover that idea that where there is a principality, there's both heavenly principalities and earthly principalities, and they are somehow related. So the pre-moderns, anywhere that they saw some kind of physical throne, they would understand that there's a heavenly throne behind that. And this is not saying that your local mayor is some kind of spiritual heavenly being. That's not the idea. You don't mix them that way. We're simply saying that there is a relation between spiritual authority and physical authority, heavenly authority and earthly authority. And as I think COVID gave us a moment to actually reconsider life in this world, that we actually live in a world where there are celestials, that we are not, a secularized state really isn't a thing. It's just simply not. And so we're trying to now recover the heritage that we've had from the founding of our nation, that, we really are one nation under God, and that God has told us something about how we are to live in this world. For example, on the issue of persecution, I mean, you're going to deal with, is the free exercise of religion a good thing? Yes, and particularly Christianity, as it has been from the foundation of our very nation. So if you are going to worship Moloch and offer up your children to Moloch and claim that that is some kind of free exercise of religion, well, it's just not. And God has actually said something about that. So God is the one who's defining what religion is. God is the one who's defining what persecution is. And until we recover that, you're not going to be able to sort out the chaos that's going on in our land when it comes to what's being suppressed, what persecution really is.
I have another question about Ephesians 6, but let's on that point. Do you think our founding fathers, but let's go before that, our founding grandfathers and the first peoples to come to this country, when they founded these colonies in these places, did they have in mind freedom of all the religions in the world and whatever blasphemy you can conceive of in this land?
Of course they didn't. And this is not even a Christian claim. You can be as secular as you would like to be. You can be a leftist as you would like to be. You can be a fan of AOC. And all you have to do is open up any history book of any kind or go back and read the original documents that these were Christian men. 50 of the 55 men at the Continental Congress were Orthodox Christians. You have Supreme Court decisions, I think as late as the 1800s, the Holy Trinity versus the United States, where our Supreme Court justices are claiming that we're a Christian land. 8 of the 13 colonies were actually established churches, which would mean that, hey, we're going to be Anglican around here. And so we're not even, you don't need to argue for an established church that says a particular state needs to be a particular Protestant denomination. That's not something that's necessary, but you can certainly look back at America and say this has been a Christian land from its founding and still is today. You are not going to go into any major city in the United States and find that the dominant religious buildings are going to be mosques or Buddhist temples. They're simply not. They are Christian churches, and the vast majority of them Protestant Christian churches, as it has been from our founding.
Back to Ephesians 6, just to drive it home again, the flesh and blood part. How are we to think about that? Like we're not fighting against flesh and blood, but like we are flesh and blood, or there is flesh and blood. What are we to do with that?
Absolutely. Well, the key would be to start with a good understanding of what a human is. What are we? Well, we are both spirit and body, and that seems to be pretty self-evident that we are being animated by something that is not merely our material. So you have a spirit, and I have a spirit. You have a soul, I have a soul, and that soul is clearly doing the animation of the physical bodies that we have. And when we die, we say if we all believed in a great dichotomy. So there's a difference between a dichotomy and a distinction. Christian theology is based on this idea of a distinction. There's a distinction between the human nature of Christ and the divine nature of Christ. There's a distinction between man and woman. There's a distinction between your body, your physicality, and your soul. But to dichotomize them is to separate, to rip them apart. And I would tell our students all the time, you certainly don't want to experience a dichotomy of your body and your soul. That would mean that your body would fall on the ground it wouldn't move anymore. We would all be a little shocked here. Your soul would go to be with the Lord. Now, eventually that's going to happen, but that's the dichotomy that you would experience as an individual. And we have experienced that dichotomy in our nation, in our land. So what's the recovery look like? The first is to say, well, it is the spirit that animates the body. Okay, it's the heavenly that animates the earthly. And so when you're looking at any kind of change that you want to see in the world, particularly in our political situation in the United States, worship is going to be at the very center of that. We around here, we say worship is warfare, and we genuinely mean that. So the spiritual warfare that we're engaged in is going to have its physical byproduct. It's going to have downstream consequences in the political realm. It's going to have downstream consequences in how we're ordered as a society. That's true of every single individual you've ever met. How he or she deals with her soul before God is going to have an impact on his or her body. And it has the same with a nation. And so we really do need to recover prayer. This is what keeps us from being radical leftists. We really can play the long game. Politics is not our God. We actually do trust in the living God. And as we do so, we're going to find that means it's going to have an impact. We're going to want the kind of leaders that honor God as well. We're going to want to know the kind of leaders that do know what real religious persecution looks like. And they know the faux version as well, because they are rightly ordered to the Lord. As our vice president said recently, that the recovery of rightly ordered loves. We study Augustine, his City of God at the college that I teach. I walk through the entire City of God with the freshmen at New St. Andrews College over the course of a year. And so to hear our vice president talking about the Ordo Amoris is a wonderful sign that we are recovering something of this kind of the centrality of our spiritual lives before God, even as a nation, and how that's going to impact the way we're ordered physically as a society.
Love it. What a great way to end our special today. Jared Longshore at Christ Church, Moscow, Idaho, fellow of theology at New St. Andrews College. Where can people learn more about you and learn more maybe for their kids or grandkids about New St. Andrews College?
Yeah, so I write at jaredrlongshore.com. You can find me on Twitter and Facebook and all of those places. NSA.edu, New St. Andrews College. It's a liberal arts and humanities Christian college out here in northern Idaho, in Moscow, Idaho. Studying the entire Western tradition, 3 years of Latin, music, rhetoric, philosophy. You're going to be working through Plato, Aristotle, all of Christendom, Herodotus, Thucydides, Augustine, Calvin, all of the others. It's a wonderful place. You can check out more at their website, or you can find them on all of their social media platforms.
That's great. Awesome. Beautiful. Jared Longshore, great to talk to you, brother. I hope we can do it again.
Thanks again.
So much for being here. I get so psyched up when I hear about places like New St. Andrews College, and hopefully they get the publicity that they deserve. The point of today's special was to talk about persecution in the world, persecution in America. I think for far too long we've relied on the Constitution. Oh, we got the Constitution, freedom of religion, we had it, we're good. It's like, yeah, but you have to do it. You have to go practice the religion. You can't just be like, we got freedom of it. All right, great. What are you doing with it? Go do it. Do the religion, do the Christianity, do the church, go. Be it. And don't be afraid of persecution along the way. We have a podcast called Politics by Faith. Please join us over there every day. We take the news of the day, run it through a biblical filter. I think you'll like it. Politics by Faith, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Mike Slater, The First TV. Spread the word.